Hi, if you're joining us live, I'm just waiting here for the room to populate. People are coming in. Anyone who's Catholic can just pray a Hail Mary for the conclave that it elects the next pope while you're waiting for us to get started. If you're not Catholic, we appreciate the prayers too.
We don't discriminate when it comes to prayers.
Correct. And actually, I remember a prominent evangelical saying at a closed-door meeting at one point during the early papacy, please keep it together because we need you. We need the Catholic Church to stay strong. Okay. Well, I'm Kathryn Jean Lopez from the National Review Institute, and with me I have Pia de Solenni and Gary Jansen. Pia, it's IWP Capital, right?
Yes.
Vice President?
Yeah, Vice President. Sorry, no. What am I? Yeah, Vice President of Corporate Engagement. Sorry.
Yes,
I
never
just got
ask
the
a person
promotion.
their name or their job title. First off, yeah. Pia also is a theologian and has worked in various church positions, and we've known each other for a million years. And, Gary Jansen has edited two popes. He works in book publishing. And at Image, you edited Benedict and Francis, and you're now at Loyola Press. And I wanted to get the two of you together, and I'm Kathryn Jean Lopez from the National Review Institute and National Review Magazine. Thank you so much if you're joining us live. Thank you if you're watching it after the fact. I encourage you to share this conversation and to always come back to National Review and National Review Institute. We have conversations like this. We obviously have writing and videos and commentary news. And in the tradition of Bill Buckley, we cover the Catholic Church, among other things. Bill Buckley, our founder. Now, so I wanted to get you, Pia, and you, Gary, a couple of days. We originally were going to do this the day after Francis died. And for various reasons, we changed it. And I think that's good. I think, I actually had, as strange as this may sound, I kind of was a little shocked on Monday morning when we learned that he died very early in the morning, even though we had all been on death watch a month ago. We were off death watch. I mean, he met with the Vice President of the United States the day before he died, on Easter Sunday. Everybody was saying he was getting better. Obviously, he was not doing well. But so there was a little aspect of not only did this world figure die, but if you're Catholic, maybe if you're any variety of Christian, if you're a person of faith, we lost a leader, a faith leader, but a spiritual father as well, especially in a Catholic context. So I think that wasn't actually an absurd reaction. I think other people experienced that. Also, of course, the head of the Catholic Church and a major world figure. So there's so many aspects to take a look at Pope Francis. And obviously, as we'll get into in the conversation, he was very different than John Paul II and Pope Benedict. And some people were happy with that. Some people were not happy with that. Some people were unsettled. Some people are still kind of assessing. I would put myself in that category. And Pia is a theologian, has worked inside the church. Gary is this great observer of culture. Also, among the books you've done, Barry, my favorite of your books is the one on the Stations of the Cross, praying with the Ignatian method, Ignatian exercises, which is a particularly kind of Jesuit worldview, and the best of the Jesuits, the Ignatian spiritual exercises, which I think are a key way of starting to really understand Francis. I actually think that one of the best pieces I've read in the last couple of days is my friend Father Raymond de Souza in First Things. He wrote about Pope Francis as spiritual director. And part of his assessment is we needed a pope, not a spiritual director. But I thought he did a really good job of like getting Francis and where he was coming from. Anyhow, so I think you both will have two different perspectives, and I'm looking forward to that. And we will, if you would put any questions if you're watching this live in the chat box, I'll weave it into the conversation. So Pia, we're a few days out now. We're anticipating the funeral in hours at this point. What are you thinking about Pope Francis?
I mean, as a Vatican watcher, I have my concerns, I have my dubia, etc. But mostly right now, in this immediate time after his death, I am just so touched by the impact that he had on so many people's lives. And I think part of this is the office of the Pope. We saw John Paul II had this, Benedict had this. I mean, there's something that resonates with people. I mean, my grandparents, when they went to Italy on honeymoon, they went and met with the Holy Father. I mean, it's just, in those days you could actually get that's how long ago it was. But anyway, that's a separate story. My point is that there's just something in the office of the Holy Father. And one of the benefits of the global media age that we live in is that more and more people can experience the Holy Father. John Paul II took the papacy to the entire world. And Benedict, as much of an academic as he was supposed to have been, he followed suit. And Francis did the same thing. And so I'm looking at, people are sending me their pictures from St. Peter's, standing in line, the videos of how long the crowds are and so forth. And more than anything, it's just people texting me that may not even be people of faith or who are not Catholic, saying how much this man's life touched them. And that is just something that I think cannot go it just can't be understated when one man can touch the life of so many people in such a profound way, when even people who are not Catholic or not Christian and are touched. Remember, and one of the strongest memories I have of Pope Francis was during the Year of Mercy. You might recall it just seemed like there was a whole series of secular journalists writing up their experience of, hey, I haven't been to church in a long time. I was walking past a church that was open and had confessions. I went into confession for the first time in 10 years, 25 years, and now I'm coming back. Uh, I just, even now, I mean, I feel that in my body. Like I get chills thinking about that. And just, again, the impact of that one witness. And again, as a Vatican observer, you and I and Gary, we're going to, at a higher level, we'll be able to quibble and have conversations about different types of impact, but I just cannot underestimate his impact on the lives of so many people around the globe in a positive way.
I remember early on in his pontificate, a lot of people will remember one of the first interviews on an airplane coming back from an apostolic journey. He uttered the phrase, "Who am I to judge?" And I remember I wanted to clear the air and put it in context, proper context, and it didn't matter. I mean, he was talking about one specific case, and it didn't matter because the way people perceived it was, oh, wait, the Catholic Church isn't judging me when they look at me, you know? So many people who had felt like whatever it was they've done or experienced had kept them at a distance from the church. Many of those people, baptized Catholics, raised Catholic, all of a sudden we're looking and saying, oh, wait, maybe they don't hate me. And I remember at another point thinking, as people were carrying on about Francis kissing babies, like, Benedict kissed babies too. But you know what? People were noticing now because he's not German. And so that was okay. That was a blessing, you know? And so Gary, as someone who is both in the secular world and the Catholic worlds, you've heard all of the reactions to Francis from the beginning to now. What are your predominant thoughts?
So when we first, and you and I talked earlier this week, you reminded me, you opened up the floodgates because I guess I've had my hands on at least 10 Pope Francis books in one way or the other. So either serving as editor or as publisher or working, on the side for something like that. So it really did bring back a lot of memories about those publications and why they were important and what excited me about them when I was working on them. And the one thing that really like strikes me now is to echo what you and Pia were saying was just kind of the universality, Catholic small c, and we have our Catholic faith, but there was a universal message that was appealing from Pope Francis. And I love JP too, and I love Benedict. I love their writings. They are so rich theologically and philosophically, but a lot of it's inside baseball, right? And so Francis really had this ability, at times he could be, talk inside baseball, but he really was able to kind of like talk to you and me, and to people who hang out in the back of churches, right? Or don't go to church or hang out outside of churches. And so that's what always kind of resonated with me for all the controversy and all the things that were said like during interviews, and some of the confusion that folks have talked about over the years. That's what really strikes me was that I run with a lot of different types of people. I have my traditionalist Catholics, I have my liberal Catholics, I have non-Catholics, atheists, weird pagans are out there who I'm friends with and love them. But they've all been reaching out to me and just saying, "Oh, my condolences, he was a
Mhm.
good man. He was a good man." So that's what kind of resonates with me, and that's what I'm thinking about. Because you had brought up also about Ignatius and Jesuits, and how do you find God in all things, right? And that's kind of one of the basic principles of Ignatian spirituality is seeking God in all things. And so what I plan to do, just kind of have what I've been doing this week is, and what I can hoping to continue is, where did God most fully reveal himself to me during Francis's papacy? So that's what I'm kind of discerning, ruminating on, and thinking about this week.
Among other things, Gary, you published, I think, what was the first Francis book, on heaven and earth.
There's a lot of debate about that.
Oh,
So
is there debate about that? I
well,
wasn't
well,
meaning to
well,
be
yeah, no,
controversial.
no, no. There's debate because we technically got out. Actually, I have a copy of it right here. Um, the book On Heaven and Earth, about 40 days after Pope Francis was elected. So it was really, we had to get that translated from Spanish into English. And it was a book that he had written with Abraham Skorka from Argentina, a rabbi, and it was a dialogue between the two of them. And we didn't have the translation. All we had was in Spanish. So we had to do a very, very quick translation. We had to edit that. And almost as a divine, like in some weird act of God Almighty, we want to rush and get this book out as quickly as possible, but translations take a long time. And there was somebody who reached out to me just as a lark and said, "Hey, I'm just kind of, I really liked Abraham Skorka and I speak Spanish and I love this book. So I actually translated his part into English already. Would you want it?" Like literally like 2 days after we decided we were going to work on this book. And and I went, absolutely. We got it. We had it vetted. It was a good translation. And so that all came together. And so we did technically get the first book out by Jorge Bergoglio. Harper will then later say that they did a interview, or American Magazine did an interview with Pope Francis, and they published that, and they said, well, that's the first real Pope Francis
Gotcha.
book. And then a couple of years later, Penguin Random House proper published The Name of God is Mercy, which was just an interview that was just for a book, and they said they had the first Pope Francis book. So it's a little bit of a debate. That's kind of like a lot of inside
Gotcha.
baseball in terms of the publishing area. But yeah, we did get that first book out, On Heaven and Earth.
Well, you mentioned that interview that he did with, it was with Spadaro, right?
Yeah,
The
correct.
American interview. And he was asked, "Who are you?" And he said, "I am a sinner."
Yep.
And Pia, I was struck by you relaying how people like went to confession when they encountered Pope Francis on the scene as this new, breath of fresh air from Latin America, however you want to put it. And one of the criticisms I remember, and I remember having long phone calls with some friends who were frustrated, and part of it was because of some American voices. Part of it was because of, the sense of a lack of clarity. But the conversation was often, let's say we're talking about LGBTQ issues, or we're talking about, let's leave it there. Because I think that's a main concern that people had. Why doesn't he talk about sin? But that it doesn't have to be those issues. It doesn't have to be sexual morality. It can be other things. Why doesn't he talk about sin more? But I do think implicit in talking about mercy is that you need to be forgiven for something. And I remember and if you lead with sin, you're probably going to lose most of us sinners because we don't want to be reminded of our sins. It's not the thing we're happiest about in life. And frankly, it's drowning and suffocating a lot of people. And so to give a glimmer of hope, and of course he died in this Jubilee year of hope, which is something we'll talk about a bit too. He had a year of mercy during his time as Pope. I remember his being in St. Peter's Square, his first Angelus message, that first Sunday, and he kept repeating himself, which he would go on to do a lot because he was very aware that everybody wasn't hanging on his every single syllable, and which is a very humbling thing for writers and speakers to learn, but it is true. And but people often only read the title, which you didn't write, your editor did. Francis knew this, and so his first Angelus message, he kept saying, he was telling a story of a woman who went for forgiveness, and then she did the same thing again, and she had to go for forgiveness again, and he kept repeating, she's going for forgiveness again, which sounds very familiar to me. People often say if they're in the habit of going to confession fairly regularly, it's always the same sins. I remember one priest saying, "Well, do you want to upgrade?" No, I don't want to upgrade my sins. So it's probably a good thing that at least you're sticking with the same ones, right? But of course, you want to be going to confession really wanting to get knocked out of this habit, right? But the fact of the matter is, and this is what Francis was saying, God never tires of forgiving you. Keep going back. And there was, again, especially in a Western context, especially in American context, a lot of people associate the Catholic Church with no's in the sexual arena, right? And all of a sudden we were having a little bit of a almost more foundational conversation. And one example I would bring before I stop talking is, which we can talk a bit about too, Laudato Si, the encyclical on ecology. I thought was an opportunity lost because here he presented. So I was even at Mass. I think I may have mentioned this to you, Pia, the other day. It was just a normal Wednesday Mass, but it turned out to be a memorial Mass for Francis. And there was this little fervorino before the Our Father. The priest is a fairly liberal parish. It's St. Francis of Assisi, Gary, as a fellow New Yorker. Which is it tends more liberal than I am. But
Absolutely.
it's got the sacraments, it's got confession, it's got Mass, it's got adoration, it's got what I
It
need.
does.
It's
Mhm.
got
And so
Jesus.
anyway, but there was this little fervorino before the Our Father, about Laudato Si and climate change. And so I think we were all supposed to pray the Our Father to end climate change. It was a little distracting, but I let it go. The reason I bring that up is because I think there was an error on the left and on the right with Laudato Si, where the left was making it about climate change politics, and the right was focusing on the air conditioning regulations. And we're missing, the Pope is talking about, the Pope, who frankly is seen by some as a progressive hope. And Rolling Stone warned him he better be that progressive hope when they put him on the cover. And he was talking about all of creation, including life and the human family, man and women, as part of creation that we need to be good stewards of. So now abortion isn't about the Catholic Church telling you, you have to have a more difficult life than you wanted to have. You have to have this child, and it's a child, or, you can't have premarital sex, or no, now it's like, oh, life is a gift. Sex is a gift, marriage is a gift. And how can we use that gift for human flourishing with joy, it's a different conversation. And so Pia, I mean, to what extent do you think that's a Pollyannish view of Pope Francis? And to what extent do you think it's real?
Oh, I definitely think it's real. And I wanted to back up too in terms of his language. I mean, the fact that he didn't lead with the conversation on sin, that's because we all know that we're sinners. Even those of us that think that we're really not that bad, at the end of the day, if we sit by ourselves for just a little while, we can see that there are some imperfections. And so, and that's the example of Jesus in the Gospels. Jesus doesn't come out and tell everybody that they're sinners, right? That's not his lead message. He does confront sinners, absolutely, but he doesn't lead by saying, "Hey, you're a sinner and you need to repent." And that's frankly not the Catholic tradition. A lot of media has convoluted things, and there have been errors of Jansenism. Okay, fine, but the overarching
Jansen.
Catholic, yeah, the overall. Oh, sorry, Gary. Accepting present company.
A living, walking heresy, Gary. Okay, go
That's
on.
right. Absolutely.
So I think, though, that it was a message that people needed to hear, and that's why he focused on mercy so early on. In terms of, and I agree. I think Laudato Si was a missed opportunity, but I think he picked up threads throughout his pontificate. And I think one of the most impactful concepts was the disposable culture. So, and it's not just the material things, but we have a disposable mindset towards people, right? And so this impacts our relationships. It obviously impacts the abortion issue, but even bigger. I mean, if you take that mindset, so my day-to-day job now with IWP Capital, we're helping shareholders to steward their investments, their public equities in a faithful manner, right? Well, if you're concerned about a disposable culture, then that's going to change the way in which a company is run, right? That's going to impact how you want your proxy votes voted. It's going to impact how you want your corporate engagement done, right? So this concept, I think, was really very impactful, and it's probably one of the biggest constructive takeaways that I take from his pontificate, and it's one that I think that we really have not plumbed and could do so on a much greater level.
And I should point out, IWP is investing with purpose, and it really, you're not paying me to do a commercial, and I just was introduced to it recently, but in many ways, it is doing, Pope Francis warned about unfettered capitalism, and there's been debate about what that is, if it really exists or not. If it does,
and that goes back to Leo the 13th, Rerum Novarum. I mean, the church has been warning about this for a long time.
And there are so many, I mean, one of the things I find encouraging is there are so many businessmen who want to do it right, who want to be Catholics in their their professional sphere. And I remember early on, there was, and there continue to be, there have been hit pieces on, full disclosure, I've been there, the Napa Institute, which Tim Bush, who's a conservative, for lack of a better word, I hate using conservative and liberal in a church context,
Agreed.
but that's how we talk. So he runs this think tank, and it has conferences, and it was seen as sort of an anti-Francis thing. If you were actually there, you would actually meet wealthier people. To some extent, it's in the Napa Valley and it's not cheap. Um, but wealthy people who are trying to live the gospel. And there's like nonstop spiritual direction. There's it's like going to Rome, you trip over masses. Wealthy people need spiritual guidance too. And you found out, fast forward some years, you had Father Jim Martin, who would be considered, and I know Gary, you know him and have worked with him, who would be considered more liberal, again, for a lack of doing dinners together in New York. And if that isn't the culture of encounter that Pope Francis talked about ad nauseum, getting people who the world would consider enemies, right? And realizing, okay, we're connected by the sacraments and the gospel. Let's have a conversation about how that looks differently and how it looks similarly. And I do think one of, I kind of laughed when I was at this mass the other day, because the celebrant or the homilist got really excited about synodality, and most Catholics paid no attention to the synod or the word synodality. I think if you went to most Catholic churches and asked about it, people would not even be familiar with the word. And it's controversial and it's confusing, and we could have many boring seminars about it, maybe some interesting ones too. But I thought it was curious that as Pope Francis dies, this is the thing that the priest was most enthusiastic about. But I think at heart, what he was enthusiastic about is the idea that, look, we've got a lot of diverse views in the church. We've got a lot of diverse people in the church. Can we actually have conversations together? At heart, it was this culture of encounter that Pope Francis was talking about. And I remember one of the times there was a controversy, Barack Obama was president, over the Al Smith dinner, because there's always a controversy over the Al Smith dinner, especially if we have a Democratic president, but there's always a Democrat and a Republican running, and the Democrat tends to be pro-abortion. And that becomes a problem, right? But I remember interviewing, this was my only cardinal interview at 1 in the morning. It was 12:30 or 1 in the morning in Tampa, Florida, after the Republican convention, because Cardinal Dolan had just said the closing prayer. And he said to me, I asked him about, because the controversy was fresh in the news. And he also said the closing prayer at the Democratic convention that year too. And it's a long story, but anyway, he said, if we can't break bread together, we're lost as a culture. And so that's why he defended the Al Smith dinner, and he hosted the Democrat and the Republican that year. And I remember he worked a miracle. This is not me campaigning for him as next pope, but Cardinal Timothy Dolan got Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton to pray together before the Al Smith dinner. So hey, there's your culture.
There's so much that could be said offline about that. So
maybe
much.
do a pay-per-view version of this later.
No, I would have to do it completely offline.
Well, I'll call you later then. Gary, what when you think about the culture of encounter, and you think about people, among people you've edited, Deepak Chopra would be an example, speaking of diverse views, right? What do you think is most potentially enduring about these years with Francis in terms of people's connection or understanding of the Catholic Church and among Catholics too?
I mean, one of the things that stands out, really based on what you guys were just saying, is his his championing for a listening church, right? To listen to people. And you're right. I mean, I think Laudato Si caused a lot of controversy, and I think it was a missed opportunity, but by us, right? Because there was so much polarization. I think when you read that and you try to read it non-politically, there's so much to be mined in there. And but we live like in a time of the Tower of Babel, where you have all of these competing voices, and everybody's talking over each other or shouting at each other, and there really is. It's this confusion, and we are living in confusing times. But I think at the heart of it, he wanted us to listen to each other, right? And so, there are a lot of things that he said in interviews and off the cuff, but if you go to the writings, which I was always impressed with, uh, those writings have a lot to say. And he does come back to this idea of just being humble, listening to each other, and reaching out to people in the margins, right? And that really like stands, those three things really stand out for me, especially reaching out to those across, reaching out people in the margins, but I also think it's reaching out to people across the aisle as well. And so that can mean many things. But obviously he's talking about the poor, and he's talking about people who just kind of like even the elders. Like we'd done a great book at Loyola Press called Sharing the Wisdom of Time, where it was Pope Francis like answering questions or in conversation with elders, right? And the wisdom that they have to share. So when we had published that first book on heaven and earth, he had done all of these topics. One of those was, he did a chapter on abortion. He did a chapter on same-sex marriage. He did a chapter on elders. He did a chapter on the marginalized. And so that book really encompassed his teachings and what he believed. And you can really use that as a great book to just kind of as a starting off point if you're just coming to Francis now or want kind of an overview. Nothing really changes from that time that he writes that first book. He expands on a lot of things. But it was really those three things. But that idea about being a listening church, you know what? Let's just take a moment. Let's listen, and then let's pray. Let's discern. And that was the other thing too. He was a prayerful man. And at the heart, one of the beating hearts of Ignatian spirituality is the idea of discernment. And I think discernment was really, really important for him. People could challenge that, people could question that, but I do think that was important for him. And then, as an asterisk, I love the fact that he called the devil, and was very clear about,
Yeah.
being, so you could say he's a progressive pope, but not when it came to kind of things like spiritual warfare or the realization that the devil is real and is, kind of a beating heart in society right now, and we have to really pay attention to that.
That
And
was
if I could just jump in,
Go ahead,
I think too, his experience, maybe it was his experience in Argentina, but I think he was able to resonate with people who had been wounded by the church or by people who say that they represent the church.
Right.
And so that's why I, I think his witness is so important. And I'm thinking in particular of two dear Italian friends that I'm pretty sure don't go to mass. I don't know why. Well, I do know why a little bit, but they were very drawn to Francis, to his spirituality. And I would have to say that if I need people praying for me, I want those people praying for me because they're prayer warriors. They have a very difficult journey, have had a very difficult journey with the church. And I think I lived in Rome for 6 years, and it's so easy to understand this when you see the church all around you. I mean, sorry, but you see the misbehaving priests, you see the fake nun, you see the person that says that they're a Catholic, but they're doing X, Y, and Z that's not Catholic. And it's all around you. It's almost suffocating at times. And I think Francis had a real heart for that. And that's why he was able to, and had an experience of it and was able to speak to it. And John Allen, from Crux, one of the things he did when Francis was first elected, he went to Argentina and he said, "Is this Pope really a Pope of the poor?" And somebody said, "Yeah, go and meet the poor." And they knew who he was, right? And I think because he'd understood in many ways also the failings of the church towards the poor. And so he's understood this on a very basic level. And I think that shaped the way that he communicated with people. Did he communicate in the way that like my inner theologian would like? Maybe not. Okay. But
Right.
that's a separate conversation. And I think on a pastoral level, he understood something that was deeply needed.
Yeah, and just to add to that, when in terms of him reaching out to people on the margin, so I think on one end you have elders, right? Because a lot of times we do have a disposable society. Certain people become a certain age, and all of a sudden they're not relevant anymore. But on the
Mhm.
other end too is children, and he really had a great love like for children, and we had done a book at Loyola Press called Dear Pope Francis, and it was a collection of all of these letters from children from around the world who just wrote some of the most beautiful, just heartfelt, innocent questions that the Pope then responded to. And but he did that throughout his whole, I mean, we have that book, but he did that throughout his entire pontificate. And so, yeah, I really do think that, for as much controversy and I know he can be a polarizing figure. I think his heart was in the right place, and all papacies have problems. I love JP too. I love Benedict, but there was controversy back then, and it'd be interesting, what would the papacy of JP2 look like today in the world of like such heightened social media,
Yeah.
and globalization? What would Benedict's pontificate look like? So I think that too, there was so much microscoping done on anything, from both sides. And I think at the end of the day, did he resonate with the people in the back of the church? And I think he did, and I think that's important to keep in mind.
Gary, you mentioned prayer, and one of, I think, the most significant moments of his papacy, which was quickly forgotten if it was even noticed, was it was a Friday afternoon. I think it was in June, right after he became Pope. And I woke up and I saw images of Francis and Benedict together. And we had never seen that before. And they were in the Vatican Gardens, and they were consecrating the Holy See in the Vatican to Saint Michael and Saint Joseph. And Catholics and others will know that Saint Michael is an archangel, and he's known as a protector, especially against evil. And Saint Joseph, obviously the foster father of Jesus, protector, patron saint of purity. I think that was no small message about what was going
Terror of
on
demons as well. That's one of
in
St.
Terror
Joseph's
of
titles.
Demons.
Yeah, that's
Terror of
right.
Demons. No small message about what was going on in the Vatican, and maybe insight into why Benedict resigned, and insight into what Francis was facing. And and I remember also fairly early on, we'll fast forward a little bit, being at the North American Pontifical College in Rome, and Francis was visiting for the first time. And it was a conference, and he was there for the Mass, celebrating the Mass, but it was a conference on Junipero Serra, who would be canonized when Francis came to the United States in 2015. And there was controversy about Serra, so the conference was really about setting the record straight about what an incredibly holy, courageous man he was, and saint, now canonized saint. But I was blessed to be hosted by the Knights of Columbus at the Mass. So I was initially sitting in the second row, and then Carl Anderson, God bless him, the former head of the
Oh,
Knights of
Carl,
Columbus,
yes.
said, "Oh, Kathryn, come in the first row." So I'm in the first row. I have this perfect view of Pope Francis, and it was my first time being close to Francis. And after communion, he didn't distribute communion. He was probably having some back problem, or I know he had we all know he had multiple medical problems. And anyway, he was sitting in the presider's chair, and communion had been distributed, and I'm watching him, and I had been watching him the whole time, and I was just noting how peaceful he seemed to be. But as it went on, I thought, could the MC like check on his vital signs? Because he had gone, and I even double checked. I'm like, he's not asleep, right? No, he appeared to be so deep in prayer that he probably wasn't even aware of where we were at that point in the mass. And I think that was real, and I think that goes back to some of the Ignatian spirituality you were talking about, Gary. There, and it requires, and obviously this is a whole nother conversation, um but it requires real rigorous attentiveness to your prayer. And it can be dangerous because it does require that,
Absolutely. Right.
people can start claiming that the Holy Spirit is telling them stuff that the Holy Spirit's not telling them. And always generally be wary of someone who's telling you the Holy Spirit is telling them something. You want to do that with a trained spiritual director, and lots of prayer, and lots of practice. And anyway, but that consecration, I thought, was a sign. I thought at multiple points during his pontificate, one of them very unnoticed was an anniversary of Evangelium Vitae that Benedict had planned, but he went through with. That's the Gospel of Life from John Paul II. There was the hours-long prayer vigil in St. Peter's Square for the peace of Syria. And there was, of course, the one that everyone remembers was during COVID, in the empty St. Peter's Square in the rain, in at night, where he was praying with us, for us. And even J.D. Vance has talked about how moved he was as a young father who was scared isn't the word he used, but I will say I think he was scared, as many of us were. And anyway, so to first of all, to miss that aspect of Francis and just see him as, the one who embraces the clearly deformed man at one of his Wednesday audiences, or the homeless, to see him to not understand that he saw prayer as action too, would be to misunderstand. There was actually a mystical aspect of him. And the other thing I want, because we only have so much time left, to get into, it's been mentioned by both of you, the throwaway disposable society he talked about. And Gary, you talked about how he loved children that include the unborn. And one thing I've been moved by in the last couple of days is I saw on social media a couple of different images, and I'm sure there are many more personal photos that people were sharing of a couple and Pope Francis blessing the unborn baby in the mother's womb. And that's something I think he did regularly, because I've seen it a number of times. And of course, I think probably people who are listening to this may be aware, he talked about how having an abortion is like hiring a hitman. He was very, very clear, and one could actually argue that's not the most merciful image that you could have, but it also speaks to how strongly he felt about this. And as with John Paul II, we all know the Gospel of Life brought a lot of people under that banner, Catholic and not Catholic. But and John Paul II talked with mercy about women who have had abortions. And obviously Francis too was reaching out to everyone. but also wanted us to be clear and was aware, very well aware of what the West and the United States in a particular way has let happen in terms of the unborn. And the last thing I'll say is that I do think, too, the fact that he met with the Vice President of the United States at the last minute didn't have to happen, as he was very clearly dying, since he died hours later, was probably the clearest message he could have sent after talking and talking and talking for his entire pontificate about the value of human life, vulnerable human life, from the unborn to the elderly and the sick. And here he was, very sick himself, and he was still meeting with the Vice President of the United States, God bless him. But he was also meeting with the 90-year-old nun on pilgrimage in St. Peter's, as he was making a pilgrimage himself after getting out of the hospital. And he was meeting with the family and the little kid who were just on vacation in the square. He was consistent until the end, wasn't he?
Absolutely. I had the real, I had the great just fortune just to be blessed to have met Pope Benedict in 2012 and to be in his presence for a considerable amount of time. And there was definitely a holiness to Pope Benedict. When you walked into the room, things got kind of quiet. He definitely seemed to exude for me like a sense of real holiness. And then a couple years later, I got to meet Pope Francis, and there was a gregarious kind of hey, let's go out for a beer kind of mentality. There was just kind of they both had two very different energies, but both were incredibly prayerful people. And the thing that brought me, so I was raised Catholic, but then of course you go out to college and all of that, and things kind of go to the wayside. But it was really the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius that kind of brought me back to my faith. And if you really explore the spiritual exercises, it's rigorous, right? And Ignatius was a soldier. He crafted the spiritual exercises like a military manual. And so Pope Francis being a Jesuit, there's a certain level of discipline that comes with prayer over time in the way that you do it. So I'm not surprised that you thought that he kind of passed away at that moment, because there is something, the spiritual exercises can really be a pathway to a mystical experience. And I just know, and I say that personally because it's happened to me, like exploring the spiritual exercises. And so, and the other image that you brought up about them, Benedict and Francis together, they did publish, Lumen Fide, and so we did a quick version of that too, with Scott Hahn doing a forward for that book shortly after it was published, and that was all about, the light of faith, really, and just, and I do think that the beautiful thing of all of our popes is that regardless of the controversy, that they exude the light of faith, right? And what I'm loving now, is that there's not a lot of things that bring people together in this world, right? And we're constantly kind of feel separate and all of that. But we're at a moment right now where the Pope has passed, and you do see this kind of collective, global coming together. It might be Pollyanna-ish. It's not going to last, obviously. It always kind of changes. But but I do think his life was light, right? And I think it drew a lot of people to the church. And we are starting to see a little bit of rumblings of some positive news in church in terms of a resurgence in the church, which is great. That could be part him. It could be part of, great people like Robert Barron, Scott Hahn, who are doing great things here in the United States. But it seems to be really exciting. So, I mean, the idea of faith is light, faith is illumination, and that coming together of Francis and Benedict with that idea that they shared, right? This idea of faith as light.
Yeah, and it's often said you can light a candle or curse the darkness. Francis did both of it, but
Sure.
I think the takeaway is people were seeing that they need something more, and I don't think it was a coincidence that as we were getting all these reports of Easter Vigil masses where 80 people were coming into the church, or there were all these different stories that he died at that precise moment. And I do think that these moments, when a moment like this, when a pope dies or a pope resigns, as we saw with Benedict, there are these incredible evangelical opportunities, because everybody's talking about God or faith, or we're not talking about signal chats and leaks, and we're talking about the enduring things that really matter. And
that's next week, once we start getting ready for the conclave.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, correct. Which, yes, those are the
Where everything goes
conversations
dark
for next week, right? We only have 10 minutes left, but I've seen a couple of questions on this, and you mentioned, Pia, the word dubia earlier. And if you can just super briefly just talk about, people were unsettled sometimes when Francis was talking or doing bishops' meetings when it came to marriage. And one person commented in the question area about, he had talked about at one point how many marriages may not be valid because people didn't properly understand what marriage was. I remember in one interview too on a plane, he talked about, reporters were pressing him asking, are you going to change situation for divorced and remarried Catholics? And he almost kind of lashed out a little bit. He said, look, even Benedict talked about this. Divorced and remarried Catholics feel like they're not a part of the church. And you could feel his pastoral concern for people. And that was a big deal for him, just in general, people feeling like they weren't welcome, right? That's the whole mercy thing. But Pia, I mean, did he change anything? Where are we left? Is there still a Catholic marriage? Where are we today in terms of marriage? And I'm sorry, we only have a moment or two for you to say that.
I mean, the teaching hasn't changed. What happened again? This is it's a communications mess, unfortunately, and so I do put part of that responsibility on Francis, and part of it on how the media manipulated that. I still have people saying to me, "Oh, this is the Pope that changed the teaching on same-sex marriage." That didn't happen. That is a message that got repeated over and over and over again. I think he really, in terms of, I mean, Benedict said something similar, that he thought many marriages were invalid. I'm sympathetic to that thinking, because I don't think that we do prepare people. I don't think that people really know even what they're undertaking. And it's not that people are going to know everything that's going to come at them during marriage, but just simple preparation. What are you saying yes to? I don't think most people know what they're saying yes to. I think a certain amount aren't capable of saying yes to that. So there is a problem that has to be looked at. By the same token, Francis issued, I believe, 2 motu proprios, at least one, I think it was 2, reforming the annulment process, because has been so onerous. The United States probably had the most streamlined version of any place in the world, but there are places where it takes years and years, and it cost a ton of money, and it was inaccessible. And yet, from the perspective of canon law, people have a right to know whether they're in an invalid marriage. So I think he helped to refine that process globally. But the teaching hasn't changed, unfortunately, because of communications malfunctions on both sides, all sides of the equation. I think this is a multi-sided equation. There is confusion about that, and that's up to us to help clarify that going forward.
And obviously, and I say this as we were having a conversation hours before the funeral mass, where there will be 2 prominent Americans, cardinals, who are plagued or adjacent to scandals. And there has been a lot of talk of Francis as a reformer. And I honestly think, and again, call me Pollyannish if you will, but I almost think, I mean, as furious as it can make me, and Pia and I had a conversation about this last night, I also wonder if it's a bit of a grace in as much as it reminds us that there's still a lot of work to be done. First of all, yes, evil still exists, right, and will remain. But even more than that, on a practical level, we still have bureaucratic problems. I think it does speak a little bit to the depth that even Benedict and Francis both tried to take this on, and there's still reform to be done. Um, but um, but I also, and of course, there's also again another webinar. The case of the artist, the Jesuit Rupnik. There's still problems that need to be addressed. And But I bring up the Rupnik in particular because there are people, and you talked about this, Pia, earlier, who have been hurt by the church, and whether and in some cases they've been directly hurt by the church, physically, mentally, sexually. Um, there are other people who have been hurt by seeing the scandal, right? And seeing
Right.
the Catholics behaving badly and worse, right? And I do, one of the things that Francis would talk about, and he would talk about this in the backdrop of identity politics in the West in particular, right? And frankly, a West that pushes it on other parts of the world, right? Our conceptions of identity politics. He would say over and over and over again that the Beatitudes are the Christian identity. I remember Robert Putnam being at a dinner with him where he said to me, Francis seems to believe Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount. And like, if Christians believed what Jesus said on the Sermon on the Mount, he was pretty clear, we wouldn't have so many of the problems that we have. And I mean, maybe this is simplistic, but fundamentally we have to be simplistic because we got to be foundational, right? I mean, is that the message, Gary, of the Francis is papacy? Is that the takeaway? Be Christian already.
Yeah. I think you nailed it. Mic drop for you and mic drop for the Pope. One of the early things that he said was that, the church is a field hospital, right? Or right, was that what he said? A field hospital, I
Yep.
think.
Yep.
And because there is so much brokenness, right? I mean, we just live in just broken times, and there are people who've been hurt by the church. And as you were saying, just observing the church, people feel broken by this. And I think it's, healing is an important part of like my life. It's I just, I've worked with a lot of doctors over the years, and so it's really become very well, in the forefront of my mind. People need healing. And I think at the end of the day, his message was to be like Jesus, right? And try to heal each other. And we do that through humility. We do that through listening. We do that by reaching out to people. So yeah, I think it was, and it's a beautiful way of bringing this to a close. There, Kathryn, was to invoke the Beatitudes, because hey, if we can get those right, we'll be fine. But we've been struggling for 2,000 years, and and we're still struggling.
Well, I remember when Cardinal Dolan was a president of the Bishops' Conference,
Mhm.
he repeated that line in one of his addresses from G.K. Chesterton, "What's wrong with the world? Me. I'm what's
Yeah.
wrong with the world." If each one of us uh, does that examination of conscience, right? Then that's where we have to start and possibly end too, right? It is the most important thing in many regards, and to take that message away. I remember, before I give you the last word, Pia, um, early on in the papacy, Pope Francis would celebrate Mass at Santa Marta, the Vatican guest house where he moved into, and daily Mass, and we would get snippets from the homily. And I remember being taken aback because I thought he was kind of scolding me every day. They were challenging. They were challenging. I remember curia priests, people working in the Vatican, thought that he was yelling at them every morning. But if you thought that, maybe there's something to take to heart. I think at heart he was trying to make us better Christians, probably because he was trying to become one himself. And Pia, what are your last thoughts here?
I think, well, first of all, thank you for getting us together for this time, Kathryn. I I will say that, I mean, quite honestly, I have kind of some complex thoughts about the whole process, because there's all the positive elements about Pope Francis that we've been talking about. There are some other questionable things that do need to be addressed and are more appropriate as we head into conclave. And so there's a mixed legacy, but honestly, at the end of the day, I mean, if we get back to looking at ourselves, each one of us at best is a mixed legacy. And for myself, I have to, first of all, underscore just how much he touched people's lives. That's just, it's undeniable. And that the impact is tremendous, right? And then, as you alluded to, I mean, just the practicing of the Beatitudes. And if we each did that, every one of us from the Pope on down, or from the ground on up, probably it's going to work better if it's the ground on up, quite honestly. I'm very anti-clerical, as people close to me know. I think we could really transform the world.
Well, and the one thing I'd add to your litany, Gary, of how what we can do to be more Christian in ways that Francis would probably implore us, reaching out to people, etc. Invite people to mass. Invite people when you're going to confession on Saturday afternoon. You never know. Sometimes people have never been invited. And it's not like you're saying, you have bad breath, when you offer a breath mint, you're actually saying, hi, I'm a sinner going to confession. Want to join me?
Yeah,
You're not judging
I'm gonna say,
anybody.
could I just add one
Yeah.
thing, Kathryn? It was the when his book came out, The Name of God is Mercy, right? The I did this thing which has been really helpful to myself, but also helpful to others I've shared with it. So if the name of God is mercy, go back into the Bible, and every word God appears, change the name to mercy and read it and see what happens. And just, use that as a kind of a small spiritual exercise, because I think at the end of the day, he really was saying, hey, you know what? A lot of broken people out there, show mercy to each other. If we can show mercy to each other, we're invoking God. We're becoming what we're meant to be, which is Christian, which is to be small Christ. But this little exercise, just going back in, Paul, St. Paul says God is love. Well, then go ahead or James. I'm getting confused, but God is love, and then go in there, and every time God appears or Jesus's name appears, substitute love or mercy, and then read and read and see what happens. It's an amazing experience. It's transformative.
In a way, his pontificate started with mercy, the year of mercy, but it's ending in the week that we're going up to the Divine Mercy, as we approach Divine Mercy Sunday. And he died Easter Monday. He'll be buried tomorrow, the day before Divine Mercy Sunday. And I think there's something incredibly comforting in that.
Absolutely.
And appropriate.
It's beautiful.
There is. And if instead of reading all the commentary on Francis, I would encourage you, if you're kind of new to him, you just vaguely paid attention to the controversies. The joy of the gospel. He talked about, your grandmother who might be a hidden saint, all the people who would never be canonized. That's what we're called to do. That's what the Beatitudes are about. In the Name of God is Mercy, that's a beautiful book. There are a lot of beautiful collections. And honestly, so many of his homilies, especially during his apostolic journeys, go back and read what he said in the United States. In Washington, he talked about how we go through life anesthetized so much. We go to things that will numb the pain, right? He knows us. It may be screens, it may be drugs, it may be drink, it may be work, whatever it is. He wants us to live more fully. And the theme of that visit was love is our mission when he came to the United States. And well, that's Jesus Christ, right? So thank you so much, Pia de Solenni and Gary Jansen, for joining me for this conversation. We could go on for hours. Maybe we'll do a conclave version of this next week.
That would be fun.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I'm Kathryn Lopez from National Review Magazine and National Review Institute, and please keep coming back for conversations like this and so much more. Thank you. Bye.
God bless.
Thank you.